Trump holds the keys for a ceasefire in Ukraine in his hands. In this video, I'm going to show you what Trump could do to achieve a ceasefire in the near future. But the big question will obviously be, will he use it? We'll talk about this as well as about anything else that has happened along the front lines and behind them in this SITREP about the war in Ukraine. Ukraine struck the Energia chemical and weapons factory in Lipetsk with 4 drones. The extent of the damage is unknown, for instance, whether or not it does impede the production. We switch to the developments along the front line, and here we start in Sumy. The Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back in the town of Kindrativka. This is here on the western side. I already showed you in the last SITREP that a Russian mill blogger was talking about counterattacks. Now we have the geolocation of it, confirming that the Ukrainians are in the eastern part of Kindrativka. Whether or not this means that the Russians in the western part are cut off or not is unclear. Just as a reminder, a Russian mill blogger was saying that the Ukrainians try to cut off the naval infantry that is in the western part of Kindrativka, and that they have already achieved that to a certain degree in this case. So whether or not they are cut off is unclear as of yet, but we have visual confirmation that the Ukrainians operate in the eastern part of Kindrativka. That's it from Sumy. We switch to Kharkiv, and here we have changes on the front lines. In the west of Vovchansk, we have geolocations showing us that the Russian infantry now has managed to enter the first buildings of the western part of Vovchansk. We have them here in the south, we have them here, and we have them here, where attacks by the Ukrainians against them were visually confirmed. That should be here, here, and roughly here. So in an area that so far was clearly inside of the Ukrainian-held territory. We recently had a geolocation here, right over the other side of the river, but not in an area that was outside of the contested zone of the gray zone. This time, though, they have entered Vovchansk. To which degree they managed to gain a foothold and set up logistics is obviously still a different question, but we now have visual confirmations that the Russians managed to cross the Vovcha here and enter Vovchansk on the western part. That's it from Kharkiv. We switch to the eastern front, and here we have the Russians advancing close to Kindrativka. No, close to Kamyanka. I apologize. This is here. Here we have the Russians at this point. Here is Kamyanka to the east. This is basically confirming that the Russians have more or less captured this area here over the past few days. Further south, the Russians have advanced northwest of Makivka here. We have a geolocation of this, where we can see this hook here, and then the tree line above it, the hook here, and the tree line above it. So at this point, the Russians are so likely this area here, or at the very least this here, is now no longer under Ukrainian control. That was it from this area. The Ukrainians are reporting that the attacks in the Liman direction are intensifying. That's in this direction, so probably more or less along these front lines the Russian attacks have intensified. I cannot confirm visual changes along the front line though. South of the Siversky Donetsk, the river that flows here, I cannot see any changes in Siversk direction itself. In the Konstantinivka direction though, we do have a couple of changes. The Russians have entered the town of Petrivka, and they managed to show their flags here, both here in the western part as well as in the northern part of it itself. So it seems like Petrivka is taken, but we have here the two majors saying that the fighting is continuing. So from the Russian side itself, from the Russian mill bloggers, we get the confirmation that Petrivka is not yet captured by the Russians. As I said a couple of times in the past, this area here has a significantly bigger gray zone than is depicted on the deep state map, and this is once again a proof. So Petrivka is definitely in the gray zone and probably to a certain degree now controlled by the Russians. They have advanced in this northern direction, but as said, the gray zone is extending further than here depicted in the whole area, at least in this eastern part of the pocket. That's it from Konstantinivka. In the Pokrovsk region, I cannot confirm any changes on the ground. And in the Dnipro direction, so where it goes into Dnipro Oblast, I have a Ukrainian counterattack in Tolstoy, which is here. A Ukrainian main battle tank drives into Tolstoy and is shooting at Russian positions from a very close distance. The Russian soldiers are in those buildings here. He's actually going basically to touching distance and is shelling Russian positions here. This is not a confirmation that afterwards the Ukrainians have taken it back, but it shows that the Ukrainians do local counterattacks that at least have some degree. Probably the western part of Tolstoy should be considered to be contested. As of now, it does not seem to be solidly under Russian control, at least from what we've seen, what we can see here along the front line. Then in the southwest of the current position, so in the southern front, we have something from Kamianske. Here, the Ukrainians have been spotted and attacked by the Russians in the southern part of the western part of Kamianske. So the Ukrainians did counterattack in this direction and seem to have advanced. We see the blocks here, and this is directly south of it. So roughly at this point, Ukrainian presence has been recorded, indicating that the Ukrainians managed to push the Russians a little bit back in this area. At least the contested area is probably a little bigger than this here. In the last SITREP, I showed you that the Russians had already reached the northern part of Kamianske at this point. But as once again, the Ukrainians are not lying down and taking it. They are conducting local counterattacks that at least have temporarily some success. This was it with territorial changes that I can observe. So overall, the strategic situation has not changed. The Russians hold the initiative. There are two areas where the Russian advances are unpleasant and problematic for the Ukrainians. This is here in the direction of Dnipro itself, where the Russians have gained some speed, even though right now it has stalled a little bit again. And the biggest issue probably is this here. If the Russians reach the town of Rodynske up here, and they are fairly close of it, then they can cut off this line here in the south for resupply and forcing the Ukrainians to use only this route. And this is, while this is a main road with a fairly good capacity, it is only 2 kilometers or something like this, or 4 kilometers away from the Russian, 4.5 kilometers away from the Russian lines. So fully inside of drone range, which will increase the losses the Ukrainians are suffering for their resupply, and thus obviously weaken the situation in Mirnograd and in Pokrovsk over the coming weeks and months, making it more likely that those towns will fall before the end of the year. That was it, though, with the overall frontline situation. We have informations from the Ukrainian troop generation. The Ukrainians have the Ukrainian Rada, the parliament, has just increased the defense budget for an additional $9.8 billion this year. So additional money is being provided for the military, and the Ukrainians have also shown their new interceptor drones for the Shahid drones. This is the example that we see now, and according to the reports, it has a top speed of 300 kilometers per hour. The Shahid drones have one of 185. So they're almost twice as fast. The range of it is 7 to 10 minutes of flying time, which should allow these drones to strike Shahid drones at least in some distance, distance of the launching point. The Russians can obviously try to counteract this with new tactics, for instance, flying higher, but this will bring additional issues the Russians are facing. Overall, tens of thousands of those drones reportedly have already been ordered, and the good thing here is that they can easily be launched from the ground without any big installations, without big infrastructure, and thus as soon as they are available in big numbers, they can be used all along the attack routes of the Shahid drones and take them out, at least while they are flying low enough for those drones to reach them. Now let's switch to the political area. Russia is forcing the inhabitants of the occupied areas to switch their SIM cards on a Russian passport until November 1st, basically forcing everyone who doesn't have a Russian passport to either give up having a cell phone or forcing that person to get a Russian passport. This is all part of the Russian initiative to Russify the area. The more inhabitants there have the Russian passport, the stronger the Russian claim can be said it to be for this area, as supposedly it's full of Russians living there, which is obviously a preparation for any future development. If the majority of the population holds the Russian passport, then international pressure towards Russia to return that area will be diminished as well. Then Trump, it's reported that Trump talked to Macron on the phone, and he said Putin wants all of Ukraine. Now, obviously, for observers outside of the White House, this is not a new acknowledgement, but this is a confirmation that this has dawned now on the US president as well. The Kremlin has responded to Trump's demand for the 50 days for a ceasefire to decline. They have declined it, and basically Russian politicians said that Russia will survive the sanctions that the US are threatening right now. So the big question will be whether or not Trump is going to implement them and to which degree. Putin believes that he can survive the Western will, that he can continue fighting until the West has given up and thus subdue Ukraine. This can only be stopped if the pressure against Putin is being increased to a degree that it's painful, that basically the Russian government is starting to believe that a victory might be possible, but it's no longer worth achieving it. For that, the pressure has to be increased massively. One way of doing that is obviously to allow the Ukrainians to reconquer their territory, but that's illusionary as of now. So one way would be to strike in the deep rear to destroy factories. Now, we have here the, what was it? Financial Times, I think. The Washington Post writing that it is likely that Trump is allowing ATACMS to be used at its full range without restrictions. Now, obviously, 18 long-range ATACMS missiles that are in Ukraine is nonsense. It's 18 HIMARS launchers probably that are meant here, but supposedly any restrictions that supposedly still were there, even though there were claims that Biden had already released the restrictions, so any restrictions would be given up. It would allow the Ukrainians to strike anything with HIMARS that's in their range. But the interesting part also is that he considered delivering Tomahawk. Trump also considered sending Tomahawk cruise missiles, the same weapons fired against the Iranian targets last month. Now, Tomahawks would be a significant difference. Right now, it's apparently not considered anymore. It's being taken off the list, but he considered it. And the interesting part is there was a claim that supposedly he asked Zelensky whether Ukraine could also strike St. Petersburg and Moscow, probably in some kind of revenge to put pressure on Putin itself. Later, it was declined, and he himself, when asked from the Trump himself, when asked by a journalist, said that this is not true. He did not say that. That must have been a misunderstanding. Still, though, Trump can deliver JASM ER for the Ukrainian Sukhoi 24, a longer range cruise missile that has roughly twice the range of Storm Shadow and Scalp. That would be a possibility, but he could also deliver the TLAM, so the Tomahawk land attack missile. With it, a lot of factories are in range, a lot of important factories are in range, and as we saw just now, Trump had at least considered it. Russia has a ton of factories in the defense industry, but some of them are so unique that it will be really hard for Russia to replace them, especially in a long range. I've taken out some examples. For instance, Ural Vagonzavod is 1,800 kilometers away from the front line. This might be slightly out of range for the TLAM. In the newest version, there is usually the expectations that, unlike, for instance, Iran or Russia, the US are downplaying the capabilities of their weapons. So while officially the TLAM does not reach the Ural Vagonzavod factory, it might be possible that Block 5 is actually reaching it if it's being delivered. So Ural Vagonzavod, for instance, would be the most important tank factory where the T90Ms are currently being produced, and it's the only factory producing T90Ms. So if it is incinerated, if it's taken apart, then the Russians cannot produce tanks anymore for quite a long time. Kalashnikov, the important gun manufacturer, is in Izhevsk. It can be reached by TLAM Block 5. Capo in Kazan is producing the T-160, Tupolev 160 strategic bomber and modernizes the Tupolev 22 M3. It's reachable by TLAM. KBP in Tula is producing anti-tank weapons, small arms, artillery, reachable by TLAM and possibly JASM AR. Almaz Antai in Moscow is producing air defense S-300, S-400 and S-500, reachable by both TLAM as well as JASM. Makayev Mlas is producing sub-launched ballistic missiles with the 1,800 kilometers distance. It might be slightly out of range as well, like Ural-Vagonzavod. NPO Roitov is producing the Zircon cruise missiles. TLAM and JASM could reach it as well. Moto Vilcha in Perm is producing multiple launch rocket systems and artillery. TLAM has the range. Avangard is in, I think, close to Moscow. It's producing ICBMs, could be destroyed by JASM and TLAM. Kurgan Mash Zavod in Kurgan is producing BMP-3, 1,700 kilometers, possibly in range, possibly slightly out of range, but the main producer for the BTR-82, Russia's wheeled IFV, is AMZ in Arzamas. It is in TLAM range. KBM Kokoma is producing Iskander. It's in TLAM and JASM range. And BOM-3 Votinsk is in Votinsk. It's producing the Kinshal. I've now given a number of factories that are producing unique equipment that the Russians need for their military power, and where in most cases they don't have alternative production facilities anymore. All of them, or the majority of them, is in range of the weapons that the US could deliver to Ukraine, and this would allow Trump to put pressure on Putin, because he simply can't afford losing those factories without losing the capability to produce those weapons for probably half a decade or a decade, especially with some strategic weapons that would be an absolute disaster for Russia's military capabilities and also for Russia's ability to export those weapons, which is one of the most important exports that Russia has overall. A first attack could reach the Shahid factory in Tatarstan. It's in range of the TLAM. It could, in one case, reduce the attacks on Ukraine massively if the Russians can no longer produce it. And at the same time, it would be a significant warning towards the Kremlin what the US is willing to do to force Russia to go to the negotiating table, while not weakening Russia strategically to a degree yet that Russia might be forced to do some measurement that could escalate it further. So this would be a potential option for Trump to put pressure on the Russians if he's willing to. We saw that supposedly he was considering delivering weapons to do that. The big question will be, though, is he going to do that? And is he going to give the permission to strike those cases? Overall, Trump has the keys for a ceasefire in his hand. Russia will be struggling to even continue the war if all those factories are actually wiped out. And the threat of them being wiped out should increase the pressure towards the Russian government that while they might still think that it's still possible to win the war, that it might become too costly, and thus Russia is willing to go for a ceasefire. The big question will be, while Trump has the keys for a ceasefire, is he going to use them? Is he going to turn them? The other problem we have with all of this is, though, Trump said Europe is going to pay for the weapons, but apparently it was not agreed with the Europeans. They learned of it from the media, from the press conference. Italy and France have already declined to pay for the US weapons. We'll have to see how the rest of Europe is facing. I've said it in the past, the war in Ukraine is a European war. So to ask for the Europeans that they foot the bill or the majority of the bill, I don't think it's outrageous, especially regarding the economic strength of all of Europe and the fact that it's simply much more important for Germany, for Poland, for France and Italy, whether or not Ukraine loses this war than it might be for somebody living in Texas. So asking Europe to pay for those might not be nice in regards to an alliance question, especially seeing the relative strength of the United States towards its allies in Europe. But it's also not something that is outrageous in itself. Will be interesting to see how the Europeans are then putting their money where their mouth is, as they've said that they want to continue supplying Ukraine. Now they have the chance. We'll have to see whether they put their money where their mouth is. That was it for today's SITREP. If you enjoyed this, please give it a thumbs up. It helps with the algorithm. Leave a comment if you have something to add. And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. And that's it for me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.